50 years ago, right now, the Warren Commission investigation into President John F. Kennedy's assassination had just been appointed and was doing its work, hoping to determine whether Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone or in conspiracy with others. The veteran investigative journalist Philip Sheehan has put the Warren Commission's work under a microscope and found it wanting. And Philip Sheehan joins us now from Washington, D.C. with more. Philip, it's great to have you on TVO tonight. How are you doing?
Steve, thanks so much for having me.
Not at all. Let's just start with the background. We, of course, are not that far removed from the 50th anniversary of the actual assassination itself, the 22nd of November, 1963. How long before President Johnson decided that he needed a panel of eminent Americans to investigate this notion more directly of how JFK was assassinated?
Well, it's amazing to discover that actually the Warren Commission was set up 7 days after the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza. It's remarkable how quickly this was all organized. President Johnson initially did not want a federal investigation. He wanted to leave this to the state officials in Texas, but he was convinced very quickly that there had to be a federal investigation. And as I say, 7 days later, it was formed.
How tough was it for him to get on that commission the people that he wanted?
Well, his biggest tough sell was to Chief Justice Earl Warren, who absolutely did not want this job and initially turns it down flat. And he's actually summoned to the White House almost exactly 50 years ago to meet in the Oval Office with President Johnson. And President Johnson puts it to him very bluntly. He says, listen, Mr. Chief Justice, if you don't take this job, there may be World War III, and you will be responsible for World War III.
And he believed him?
He did, and of course there might have been some reason. President Johnson had, at this moment, in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, there was a belief that this might have been the work of the Soviet Union or Cuba, and that the government might well be on the path to, Armageddon, to World War III.
Tell us some of the more high-profile members of the commission, who they were, that we might still remember today.
Well, the one we probably best remember is a man who was then a member of the United States House of Representatives, who later became President of the United States, Gerald Ford. Also on the panel were a couple of senators, probably not so well known to most of your listeners and certainly or viewers, and certainly not in the United States as well. But there was also a fellow by the name of Allen Dulles, who had run the CIA for many years ahead of President Johnson's ascension to the White House, and also a fellow by the name of John McCloy, who was the chairman of the World Bank. But clearly the best-known figure at the time was Chief Justice Earl Warren, who President Johnson saw as this ultimate symbol of integrity.
Cokie Roberts, the American broadcaster, has a bit of a connection to the panel as well, yes?
Her father was a congressman by the name of Hale Boggs from Louisiana, and he was a member of the commission, although, truth be told, he was not very involved in the investigation.
Okay. The commission begins its work. It does its investigating. Immediately, as you discover, there are some peculiarities surrounding its investigation, and I want to go through some of them with you right now. For example, the coroner, his original autopsy notes, he destroyed. How come?
Well, it's a big theme of my book, just how much vital evidence about the assassination begins to disappear or is destroyed within hours of the assassination. President Kennedy is killed on a Friday. On Saturday night, the pathologist who conducted the president's autopsy is destroying the original autopsy report and all of his notes from the autopsy room and pushing them into the fireplace of his home in suburban Washington. He would say he did this because he feared that these blood-stained notes and the blood-stained initial report might turn up as some sort of ghoulish souvenir in a museum someday, and he didn't want that to happen. But of course, when this was discovered later on, there was a great suspicion that he was trying to hide something by destroying these documents.
You, having looked at it, which do you think makes more sense?
Well, I think it's quite possible there were errors that he made in the initial autopsy that he probably didn't want anybody to know about. But all we have is his word at this point, because we don't know what was in those documents.
Did Lee Harvey Oswald, who of course did the assassination on JFK, have any connection or association with the FBI before the assassination?
Well, it turns out that the FBI had Oswald under pretty aggressive surveillance before the assassination, for months before the assassination. And in fact, it appears that Oswald became so annoyed about this surveillance that he actually delivered a handwritten note to the FBI office in Dallas just a few weeks before the assassination, in which he apparently said that, leave me alone, leave my wife alone. But same situation. We'll never know exactly what was in that note because FBI agents in Dallas destroyed it within days of President Kennedy's assassination.
Oswald also made a trip to Mexico before the assassination. And what did you find out about that trip that you thought was noteworthy that the commission declined to pursue?
Well, it's maybe not so much what the commission declined to pursue, it's what the Central Intelligence Agency hid from the Warren Commission. Because it turned out that much as the FBI had Oswald under surveillance in Dallas before the assassination, the CIA had Oswald under surveillance when he makes this mysterious visit to Mexico in the fall of 1963. What went on in Mexico City we'll never quite know because, again, so much of that evidence has disappeared or been destroyed over the years. But Oswald appears to have gone there to get the paperwork, the visas that would allow him to defect to Cuba. He was an avowed Marxist. He wanted to defect to Cuba much as he had once tried to defect to the Soviet Union. And who he encounters in this trip in Mexico is a great subject for further investigation because I found people in Mexico when I was down there last year who say they saw Oswald, who say they saw him in the company of people who were very supportive of Fidel Castro's government in Cuba. Which
brings the whole angle of whether or not Castro was involved in the assassination into play. Did you come to any conclusions about that?
Well, I certainly, the conclusion I come to is that Oswald was certainly in contact in Mexico City with people who were either working for Castro's government in the Cuban embassy in Mexico City or who were Mexicans who were very supportive of Castro's government. And you have to keep in mind the time frame we're talking about. This is the absolute height of the Cold War. This is just a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis when the United States had almost gone to war over Cuba, at a time when we now know President Kennedy was trying to kill Castro. And isn't it possible that some of these people that Oswald was dealing with in Mexico, these Cubans, these Mexicans, supporters of Castro's government, that some of those people might have encouraged Oswald to do what he would do a couple of months later?
Well, I think you go further. Do I remember accurately reading in your book that Oswald said out loud in public in Mexico, "I want to kill John F. Kennedy"?
It really is incredible to discover that the FBI learned that while Oswald was in Mexico, in one of these meetings he had in the Cuban embassy, he made the statement, "I'm going to kill President Kennedy," which means that people in the Mexican embassy the Cuban embassy in Mexico knew that Oswald was talking openly about his intention to kill the president. Now, the FBI prepares a report for the Warren Commission summarizing what it learned and the fact that Oswald made this threat. But that document, too, would disappear. The Warren Commission investigators, many of them are still alive, tell me they never saw that document, and they're astonished that they never got that piece of information.
Okay, the Warren Commission decides not to call several witnesses who you would think could be helpful to their work. And I want to go through a bit of a list here. The president's widow, Jackie Kennedy, was not called before the commission. How come?
Well, she was called, but only very briefly and only at the tail end of the investigation. And this reflects Chief Justice Earl Warren's dedication to protecting the legacy of President Kennedy and to protecting the privacy of the Kennedy family, even if that meant that not all the facts were gathered. Chief Justice Warren just adored President Kennedy and his family, and he goes out of his way again and again and again to shield them from any special scrutiny by the Warren Commission, again, even though that meant some facts were never gathered. And Mrs. Kennedy was interviewed, but very much at the tail end of the investigation, and I believe it was for only 9 minutes.
Correct, and not only that, I wrote down the date. It was June 5th, 64, so it's 7 months after the assassination. And when I guess I should have been more specific in the question, she wasn't called in. They went to her at her home, right? And she testified at her home.
This again reflects Chief Justice Warren's devotion to the Kennedy family. He was not going to require the president's widow to come all the way across town to the offices of the Warren Commission. He goes to her house in Georgetown and conducts this very, very brief interview. And the staff of the Warren Commission was told nothing about this, even though many of them had been pressing for months for this interview with Jackie Kennedy.
The president's brother, Bobby Kennedy, who was Attorney General, was he called to testify?
He was not. And, I tell you, Robert Kennedy's involvement in this whole saga is very troubling start to finish. You would think he would be a natural person to testify before the Warren Commission, both because he was his president's closest advisor in many ways. He might have known if the president had feared particular conspiracies, if he feared for his life. And he was also the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. He was the Attorney General. He's somebody you would think would have questions to answer before the Warren Commission. But at the end of the day, Chief Justice Warren agrees that Bobby Kennedy doesn't have to appear. And Bobby Kennedy sends a letter to the Warren Commission in which he makes the claim that he has no evidence or information about any conspiracy to kill his brother. And what we now know is that that was very evasive, if not a lie. He had a lot of suspicion about a conspiracy.
Which his son of the same name recently confirmed, right?
His son made this remarkable statement in, I believe it was January of last year, at a public forum in Dallas to honor his father, Robert Kennedy. And he made the statement that his father had never believed the Warren Commission. He always thought that his brother John had been killed either by the mafia or by the Cubans or by even some rogue element of the CIA.
All right, given that the FBI had Oswald somewhat under surveillance at the time, it might be logical to have J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, testify before the commission. Was he called?
And he did. And he did call. He did testify. And what we now know is that, of course, he lied through his teeth when he appeared before the Warren Commission. He said that the FBI had done absolutely nothing wrong in its investigation of Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination, when it turns out that behind the scenes, J. Edgar Hoover was disciplining his agents because of all of the mistakes they had made.
The CIA, again, given the plot to kill Castro that they were involved in, it might have been useful to have them cooperate with the Warren Commission investigation. Were they cooperative?
Well, no. It's interesting. They put on the facade of being cooperative, and I must say that the record shows that the CIA really bamboozled the Warren Commission. They gave the appearance of offering full cooperation when, in fact, we now know they hid a tremendous amount of evidence about Oswald and a tremendous amount of evidence that might have pointed to the involvement of the Cuban government in the assassination. Among the other things they do not tell the Warren Commission, CIA officials, is the fact that for years they have been trying to kill Fidel Castro. In fact, they had involved the mafia in trying to kill Fidel Castro, which would certainly give Castro a motive to want to see President Kennedy dead. But again, the Warren Commission has told nothing about those assassination plots.
And again, you tell us a former head of the CIA, Alan Dulles, is a member of the commission. So surely he would have known about this. Was he helpful in any of this?
Well, I am left confused by Dulles' involvement. Dulles was dismissed by President Kennedy after the debacle in the Bay of Pigs. At that point, I think Dulles is in his late 60s. And friends of his who knew him at the time say that the humiliation of losing his job really made him senile, that he lost connection with reality. And that it's not surprising he would not share whatever information he might have had about the Kennedy plots or about other CIA activities with the Warren Commission. But there are a lot of people who say, Alan Dulles almost certainly approved some of these Castro plots, that he should have known many things that he should have shared with the Warren Commission, but clearly did not.
You would think that any serious investigation of what happened at Dealey Plaza on the 22nd of November 1963 would have done what many subsequent television networks, documentary filmmakers, etc. have done over the years, which is to actually go to the site and do some tests. Did the Warren Commission do that?
Well, they did some. I mean, they did have a reconstruction at the scene of Dealey Plaza. They brought FBI and Secret Service sharpshooters in. They brought cameras in. They did some sort of reconstruction. But the question will always be whether they really did enough. Though at the end of the day, I think every major investigation, every major reconstruction done by television networks and others in all the years since, the Warren Commission, have suggested that on the question of what actually happened in Dealey Plaza, did Lee Harvey Oswald fire the shots? Did this one bullet, the famous single bullet, go through the bodies of both President Kennedy and Governor Connally? Basically, the Warren Commission findings have been supported through all these years.
Who came up with the single bullet theory?
Well, there's a little debate about that on the staff, but I think at the end of the day, it was a young lawyer, a staff lawyer from Philadelphia, a fellow by the name of Arlen Specter, who would later go on to great fame in this country because he became a very prominent Republican member of the United States Senate.
Mostly. He flipped at the end, didn't he?
He did. In his final years, he was a Democrat.
Right. John Connally, of course, the governor of Texas, and in that motorcade, and the other person on that day to be struck by a bullet who was a part of the motorcade, always disputed that single bullet theory. Do you know why?
Well, I mean, the critics of Governor Connally will say that he just sort of insisted that he had to have his own bullet, that there was something demeaning about the fact that he didn't get his own bullet. And, you know, he was shot in Dealey Plaza. He nearly died in Dealey Plaza. So I don't think it's surprising that his recollection of what actually happened at that moment was flawed. And I think history shows it was flawed. He was hit by the same bullet that had also passed through President Kennedy's body.
I'd like your take as well on something that's gained a lot of currency around the anniversary of the assassination, and that was this story about the Secret Service agents. You talk about this in the book, staying out till the very wee small hours of the morning the night before the assassination, essentially getting drunk, or certainly drinking too much. Question, did the commission investigate whether that contributed in any way to JFK's vulnerability the next day?
Well, they certainly focused on it. And the record shows, and again, you know, the Secret Service, the regulations for agents of the Secret Service barred them from taking even one sip of alcohol. That if you drink on the job in the Secret Service, certainly in the White House detail, that is a fireable offense. And apparently a number of agents the night before the assassination, when they were in Fort Worth, Texas, go out drinking, and some of them have more than one drink. And they go to bed at something like 3 or 4 in the morning. And the question becomes for the commission, you know, isn't it possible that if they had not been out drinking, if they'd gotten a good night's sleep or at least more sleep the night before, whether they could have been better able to protect the president? And the commission focuses on that. Chief Justice Warren seems particularly outraged by the actions of the Secret Service agents. And he's also outraged, too, that the Secret Service seems to have done its best to try to cover up what had happened with this drinking episode.
Interestingly enough, someone from the commission talked to Fidel Castro about whether or not Cuba was involved. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the nice scoops in my book, which is that apparently, you know, obviously almost immediately after the assassination, a lot of suspicion focused on Fidel Castro, that he was somehow involved. And Fidel Castro, we now know, apparently sent word that he was willing to testify before the Warren Commission. In those days, though, and to some extent even to this day in Washington, Fidel Castro is, you know, the devil. You can't be seen having a public meeting with Fidel Castro. So apparently the Warren Commission very, very secretly, in a secret that has held mostly for these 50 years, dispatches one of its young lawyers to go to the waters off Cuba, where he encounters Fidel Castro on his yacht. And apparently this lawyer, who told me this story for the book, says that he sat there for 3 hours listening to Fidel Castro explain how he had nothing to do with the President Kennedy's assassination. And
why did this lawyer think that that testimony was credible?
Well, he came back, and he was a very careful lawyer, a fellow by the name of William Coleman, who's still around, who was a transportation secretary in Gerald Ford's presidency. He says that he didn't come back able to say that Fidel Castro had nothing to do with the assassination, but he saw nothing in what Castro told him that suggested that he did have anything to do with the assassination.
I see. You raise an interesting issue in the book that I hadn't seen written about anywhere else, and that was this idea of Oswald having a big blow-up fight with his Russian-born wife, Marina, the night before the assassination. And I guess you posit the possibility that had that fight not happened, Oswald might not have been in as frenzied a state as he turned out to be on the 22nd, and maybe he doesn't shoot JFK. Is that pushing the what-ifs too far?
No, not at all. And it's tragic on so many different levels. But Marina Oswald said that on the night before the assassination, she was then separated from Lee. Lee was living in Dallas. She was living with a friend near Dallas. He comes to see her the night before and pleads for a reconciliation, pleads for her to come live with him in Dallas and to bring their children to Dallas. And she turns him down. And she said that, and apparently this confrontation with Lee Harvey Oswald leaves Oswald in tears. And it's apparently the next morning when he picks up his rifle and goes to Dallas and kills the president. And Marina Oswald said that if she had only taken her husband back in that night, the world would be a different place.
Let's continue the what-ifs a bit here. Lee Harvey Oswald commits this assassination. What was his plan after doing that?
Well, we'll never know for sure, but a theory that is offered by the Warren Commission staff and investigated is whether or not Oswald was trying to flee to Mexico. And this was a theory that was most aggressively pursued by a young lawyer on the staff by the name of David Bellin. And Bellin takes out all the bus schedules and the road maps, and he determined in his own mind that it was quite possible that Oswald was trying to get back to the border with Mexico where somebody might be waiting for him. And Bellin's theory was that when Oswald had gone to Mexico in September 1963, he had made contacts there, that maybe he had plotted out the assassination and had plotted out his escape with the idea that somebody would meet him on the border and might spirit him through Mexico, possibly to Cuba. But none of that theory goes into the Warren Commission report, even though it might have been pretty valuable, because the decision is made that the Warren Commission does not want to encourage conspiracy theories.
Well, and interestingly enough, the Warren Commission does not shut the door on conspiracy theories. Why did they not do that? Because presumably that was one of the reasons Johnson put it together in the first place.
Well, they mostly rule out conspiracies, but you're right, they do leave open the door just a bit. And they only leave open the door because a couple of the members of the commission are insistent that the door be left open. Apparently, the initial drafts of the Warren Commission report were going to entirely rule out the possibility of a conspiracy. But a couple of the commissioners put up a real fight at the end and insist that the door be left open. Otherwise, they'll dissent. They won't sign the report.
Do you think, as a result of your book, that door is a little wider open or more closed now?
Oh, I think it's more open because there are people still alive in Mexico, and I found some of them for my book, who seem to have encountered Oswald, seem to have seen him in the company of people who might well have wanted to see President Kennedy dead 50 years ago. And who those people were and what communications they had with Oswald is information that was really completely unexplored by the Warren Commission, by the FBI, by the CIA. I can tell you that these people are still there and they're still willing to talk about it, and they may have valuable information that still might point to new answers about the assassination.
Okay, let's go back 50 years ago again and take us to, I guess it's the late summer or early fall when the Warren Commission releases its report. Tell us how much or how little America embraced the conclusions of the report.
Initially, it was widely accepted. The polls showed that most of the public were willing to accept the idea that there was no conspiracy and that Oswald had acted alone. Certainly, the mainstream media, the major newspapers, magazines, television networks, they embraced the findings of the Warren Commission, and they said that they accepted the idea that there had been no conspiracy. But it wasn't very long before the tide turned and opinion polls showed that most Americans believed that the Warren Commission had been wrong, that there had been a conspiracy, and over the years that plurality of people who believe in a conspiracy has only grown.
How much did Oliver Stone have to do with that?
An awful lot. And that for many millions of Americans, the Oliver Stone movie is what they accept as the truth. I will tell you the one great advantage of the Oliver Stone movie to people like me is that the Stone movie created such a furor in the United States, so many wildly spinning conspiracy theories, that Congress acted by declassifying virtually everything in government files involving the assassination. That's millions of documents that are now available to us that probably wouldn't otherwise be available to us.
Some follow-up here. Marina Oswald had a couple of kids with Lee, I think. Did she not?
Right.
Do we know where?
And there's.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I say, and the kids seem to have led very fine lives, and You know, I think it's probably a fine thing that journalists have mostly left them alone. Marina Oswald continues to live with another husband in the Dallas area. It's actually surprising she'd want to remain there, but she did.
And do we know anything about these two kids? Because it's pretty hard to imagine there could be a worse fate in America than to grow up knowing you're the offspring of Lee Harvey Oswald.
You'd think, but again, my understanding is, and I haven't really pursued this, but my understanding is they lead fine, upstanding lives, and mostly the press leaves them alone.
Okay.
Which is as it should be. Which is as it should be.
Right. They had nothing to do with this, obviously. The Zapruder film, perhaps the most famous home movie ever taken in American history. Where is the original Zapruder film today?
It's just down the street from where I am now. It's stored at the National Archives, very much like a fortress-like facility outside Washington, D.C., and it's stored, as you can imagine, under remarkably delicate conditions. I understand it is the most watched piece of a motion picture in recorded history.
Do you believe that all of the irregularities that you've uncovered tarnishes the Warren Commission's ultimate findings?
Yes, and because I think it's very clear that the Warren Commission was rushed. It was finished in 9 months, that much too quickly, with many, many questions unanswered. And clearly, many of the staff members, the people I talked to for this book, they were concerned 50 years ago that this was being rushed and that questions weren't being answered. And you know, the roster of prominent conspiracy theories is a long one, and it includes people like President Lyndon Johnson, who at the end of the day rejected the findings of the Warren Commission. You know, he felt at the end of the day that Castro probably did have something to do with the president's killing. You know, Robert Kennedy was a conspiracy theorist. He didn't accept the Warren Commission. You know, the Warren Commission's legacy is a very checkered one.
How about you? You've looked at this as carefully as anybody in America. What conclusion do you come to?
Well, I think the most important conclusion for me is that there is still evidence out there to be gathered. There are still people to be talked to. You know, I do wonder whether or not, when Oswald makes this mysterious trip to Mexico City, whether or not he was dealing with people who may have encouraged him to go back to Dallas and to do what he did. And, you know, those people have never been identified, and certainly they're people who would have some culpability in President Kennedy's assassination.
One last question. Had everybody, and by that I mean the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, had everybody involved in the president's life in Dallas on that day in November done their jobs properly, do you have any doubt but that the outcome of that day would have been different?
No, and again, another big conclusion for me, and I think a very important conclusion of my book, is that President Kennedy's death was entirely preventable. We now know that the FBI and the CIA knew a lot about Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination, and that they had more than enough to suggest he might be a threat to President Kennedy. And if anybody had simply passed along any of that information to the Secret Service just hours ahead of President Kennedy's arrival in Dallas, again, the world would be a different place. President Kennedy would have survived the trip.
The name of the book is A Cruel and Shocking Act, The Secret History of the Kennedy Assassination. Philip Sheenan, it's really good of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Steve, a real pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.